The heavy oak doors swung shut behind me, sealing me inside a room that smelled of floor wax and judgment. I walked toward the plaintiff's table, clutching a cardboard box, feeling the weight of a dozen pitying stares on my back. I represented myself in court. My husband laughed. "You're too poor to hire a lawyer," he said. Everyone agreed. I stood up, started speaking. After my first sentence, the courtroom froze. They expected a plea for mercy, but I had brought something far more dangerous than tears. Mark sat 10 feet away, looking like a man who had already won the lottery. He wore the charcoal Italian suit I had picked out for him years ago, back when we still pretended to be partners. Beside him, Mr. Sterling arranged leather binders with the precision of a surgeon preparing to amputate. They exchanged a look, a shared, smug smirk that dismissed my existence entirely. To them, I was nothing more than a clerical error they needed to delete before lunch. The judge, a stern woman with glasses perched on her nose, shuffled her paperwork and sighed. She looked at my empty table, then at my battered file box, and finally at me. Her expression was not unkind, but it was thick with exhaustion. "Mrs. Harrington," she said, her voice echoing in the high, ceilinged room. "Are you certain you wish to proceed without counsel? The court strongly advises against it in high asset cases." Mark chuckled softly, a sound like dry leaves cracking under a boot. I did not look at him. If I turned my head, I would see the cruel amusement dancing in his eyes. Instead, I focused on the clerk typing in the corner. For a decade, Mark told anyone who would listen that I was simple. He claimed I was good with recipes and bad with numbers. I had let him believe it because it was easier than fighting for respect. Today, that silence ended. I placed my hands on the table to stop them from shaking. "I am ready, Your Honor," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I did not open with a sob story about abandonment. I did not ask for alimony. Instead, I picked up a single sheet of paper. Before opening statements, I must address a procedural matter regarding Article 4 of the Financial Disclosure Act. Mr. Sterling stopped organizing his pens. His head snapped up so fast, I thought he might have pulled a muscle. He had not expected me to know that statute existed. The air in the room shifted instantly, transforming from bored detachment to sharp, electric tension. Mark's smile faltered, the corners of his mouth twitching downward as he glanced at his expensive lawyer for reassurance. But Sterling was too busy staring at me, his eyes narrowing as he tried to calculate just how much I knew. The silence that followed wasn't the quiet of respect. It was the terrified silence of a predator realizing, for the very first time, that the prey has teeth. 3 years ago, the only thing I represented was a convenience to my husband. I sat at our kitchen island, late one Tuesday, the smell of Mark's expensive scotch lingering in the air. He had tossed a stack of disorganized receipts onto the granite counter before heading to bed. "Handle this mess, Leah," he had muttered, not bothering to look at me. "I am too busy making real money to waste time on admin." He thought he was assigning me a chore. Under the hum of the refrigerator, I spent hours smoothing out crumpled invoices and entering data into spreadsheets. Mark assumed my silence. I was struggling to understand the complex terms. He was wrong. I was not struggling. I was learning the rhythm of his deception. I memorized vendor names that did not exist and referenced wire transfers that had no clear destination. He handed me the keys to his kingdom, because he was arrogant enough to believe I couldn't drive. The memory dissolved as Mr. Sterling's baritone voice filled the courtroom, painting a picture of a helpless woman. He paced before the judge, gesturing toward me with feigned sympathy. "Mrs. Harrington is a devoted homemaker," he said, emphasizing the word like it was a diagnosis. "But she is woefully out of her depth regarding corporate finance. Her claims are born of confusion, Your Honor, not malice." He paused for effect, waiting for the judge to nod in agreement with his narrative. Mark leaned back in his chair, watching the performance with heavy, lidded satisfaction. He had convinced himself that this was an act of mercy. In his mind, stripping me of assets was simply protecting the estate from my incompetence. Sterling continued, claiming that my requested disclosures were irrelevant and burdensome fishing expeditions. The judge looked toward me, her eyebrows raised in question. The room waited for me to stutter, to cry, or to prove them right by collapsing under the pressure. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my thrift store blazer. I did not offer a rebuttal about my character or my intelligence. Those were subjective battles I could not win today. Instead, I looked directly at the court reporter to ensure every digit was captured accurately. I am not asking for a fishing expedition, I stated clearly. I am asking for the transaction history of 3 specific accounts held by Aurora Holdings in the Cayman Islands. I recited the numbers. The string of 12 digits hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. I saw Mark's hand freeze halfway to his water glass. These were not random numbers found in a public filing. These were the account identifiers he kept on an encrypted drive in his office safe. He blinked rapidly, his confident mask slipping to reveal a flash of genuine panic. He looked at Sterling, but his lawyer was too busy frantically checking his notes to notice. These accounts, I continued, keeping my eyes locked on my husband, show zero balance on the marital disclosure forms. Sterling stood to object, but his voice lacked its earlier boom. He stammered something about relevance, but the judge was already writing the numbers down. Mark had spent years burying his secrets under layers of corporate shells, convinced no one was watching. He thought he had dug those holes deep enough to be safe. But he forgot who held the shovel. James Thorne, the chief financial officer of Harrington Logistics, walked to the stand like he owned the courthouse tiles. He adjusted his silk tie and smiled at Mark, a look of camaraderie that bordered on conspiracy. Thorne had been at our Christmas parties for years, eating my appetizers while ignoring my presence. Now, he swore to tell the truth with the casual indifference of a man ordering lunch. Sterling guided him through the basics. Thorne projected an air of absolute, untouchable competence. The company has faced significant headwinds, Thorne testified, his voice smooth as polished glass. Liquidity is down. Mr. Harrington has actually taken a pay cut to keep us afloat. He produced a stack of heavily redacted charts, waving them like a shield. The narrative was simple: Mark was a struggling hero, and I was a greedy vulture picking at a carcass. Mark nodded solemnly from the defense table, performing the role of the martyr perfectly. It was a well-rehearsed lie. When it was my turn, I didn't approach the stand immediately. I stayed at my table, flipping through my notes with agonizing slowness. The silence stretched until Thorne shifted comfortably in his chair, checking his watch. Finally, I looked up. "Mr. Thorne?" I said softly. "You stated the general ledger reflects all liquid assets. Is that correct?" He smiled, a condescending expression reserved for children. "Absolutely, Mrs. Harrington. Every penny is accounted for in the primary report." "Then explain the system error 404. Entries on the internal backup logs," I said. The room went quiet. Thorne's smile froze, looking like a cracked porcelain mask. He blinked, once, twice. "That is just a technical glitch," he stammered, his smooth voice suddenly grating. "It generates when the server resets." It was a good answer for a layman. Unfortunately for him, I wasn't asking as a layman. I was asking as the person who secretly fixed his laptop. "A server reset doesn't move funds, Mr. Thorne," I countered, holding up a screenshot of the code. "But a macro command labeled 404 does." I walked toward him, placing the paper on the witness stand. "I wrote this macro 3 years ago to automate payroll." "Who modified it to divert 2% of gross revenue into the Cayman holding accounts?" Thorne looked at the paper as if it were radioactive. He knew exactly whose digital fingerprints were on it. Beads of sweat appeared on Thorne's forehead, glistening under the harsh courtroom lights. He looked desperately toward the defense table, seeking an exit strategy. But Mark was not looking at his CFO. Mark was staring at the table, his knuckles white as he gripped a pen, refusing to make eye contact. The silence from the defense was deafening. Thorne realized in that moment that he was alone. The corporate shield he hid behind had just evaporated into thin air. I was instructed to implement certain tax efficiency strategies, Thorne whispered. He didn't confess fully, but the evasion was damning enough. The judge stopped taking notes and peered over her glasses at the witness, her expression hardening into steel. Sterling finally jumped up to object, shouting about proprietary software and trade secrets, but it was too late. The damage was done. The CFO looked at Mark for help. But Mark was too busy staring at me, like I was a ghost. The silence following Thorne's exit hung heavy in the room, thick with unsaid accusations. Mr. Sterling did not let it linger. He rose from his chair with the gravitas of a funeral director, buttoning his jacket to signal a shift in gravity. He moved to the podium, not to address the finances, but to address me. His expression softened into a pity that felt sharper than a knife. "Your Honor," he began. "We must contextualize these wild accusations." Sterling produced a new binder, this one bright red, and placed it gently on the judge's bench. "Mrs. Harrington has a documented history of severe anxiety," he stated, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. He pulled out a timeline, holding it up for the court to see. Panic attacks, insomnia, obsessive fixation on abandonment. Mark kept his eyes on the table, feigning sorrow, while Sterling painted me as a woman cracking under the weight of her own fragile mind. During 2021, the plaintiff repeatedly sought therapy for irrational fears of financial ruin. Sterling continued, reading from a page I recognized. It was a summary from my old therapist. She claimed her husband was plotting against her, hiding resources, and lying about his whereabouts. He looked at the judge with mournful eyes. These were described as persecutory delusions. The very same plots she is presenting to this court today. It was a masterstroke of gaslighting, performed for a legal audience. The judge shifted her gaze toward me, her earlier respect replaced by visible wariness. I could see the doubt taking root behind her glasses. If I was crazy, the numbers didn't matter. If I was paranoid, the hidden accounts were just glitches in my head. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the ghost of the panic attacks they were weaponizing against me. Mark finally looked up, a small, triumphant smirk touching his lips. He thought he had me. I stood up, ignoring the burning heat in my cheeks. "Objection," I said, keeping my voice flat. "Counsel is mischaracterizing a medical opinion to excuse financial fraud." I reached into my cardboard box and pulled out a sealed envelope. "This is a sworn affidavit from Dr. Evans, the very therapist Mr. Sterling just quoted." Sterling stiffened. He hadn't expected me to stay in touch with the doctor he was using to bury me. I walked to the bench. Dr. Evans clarifies that my anxiety was situational. I explained as the judge sliced open the envelope. Specifically, it was a reaction to gaslighting. The judge read the document in silence, her eyes darting back and forth across the page. Sterling tried to interrupt, but the judge held up a hand to silence him. The affidavit states that Mrs. Harrington's fears were reality-based responses to inconsistencies in her environment. The crazy wife defense was crumbling before it started. I turned back to Mark, whose smirk had dissolved into a pale, hollow stare. "And if you check the dates on Mr. Sterling's timeline," I said, pointing to the red binder, "you will see something interesting." I didn't need to shout. Every instance of my paranoia coincides exactly with the dates Mark opened a new offshore shell company. They tried to paint me as crazy, but all they did was prove I was perceptive. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the courtroom floor. Sterling looked rattled, whispering furiously to Mark, who was gripping the table with white, knuckled rage. The judge checked the clock, clearly impatient with the defense's failed theatrics. I returned to my seat, but I did not smile. To catch a man like Mark, I needed to look vulnerable again. I slumped my shoulders, letting a heavy sigh escape. I shuffled my papers with deliberate clumsiness. I needed him to believe I had played my only card. "Your Honor?" I said, my voice wavering just enough to sound exhausted. "I would like to address the vacation property in Aspen." I fumbled with a document, dropping it before picking it up with shaking hands. I think there might be an inconsistency in the valuation." Sterling watched me like a hawk, sensing blood. He stood up slowly, regaining his confidence. "Objection," he drawled. "We have already provided 3 independent appraisals." Mrs. Harrington is clearly grasping at straws now. Mark's eyes lit up. He saw the hesitation. I looked down at the table, refusing to meet Mark's gaze. I don't have the deed right here." I mumbled, pushing a folder away as if giving up. "Maybe we can move on." It was the surrender Mark had been waiting for all day. He leaned toward Sterling, his whisper loud enough to carry. "She's done. Let me finish this." Sterling shook his head, gripping Mark's arm. He knew better than to put a narcissist on the stand, but Mark was no longer listening to legal advice. Mark shook off his lawyer's hand, with a sharp jerk of his shoulder. He stood up, smoothing his jacket, with an arrogant flourish that made my stomach turn. "Your Honor?" Mark announced, his voice booming with unearned authority. "I would like to clarify this matter myself. I have nothing to hide, unlike my wife." Sterling closed his eyes, a look of pure defeat washing over his face. He sat down heavily, burying his head in his hands. The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Proceed." "Mr. Harrington." Mark walked to the witness stand with the swagger of a man, entering a boardroom to fire his assistant. He winked at the court reporter as he took his seat, adjusting the microphone until it was perfectly positioned. He swore the oath quickly, treating the Bible like a prop. He looked at me then, his expression a mix of pity and disdain. He saw a woman in a cheap blazer with a messy box of papers. He saw the past version of me. He didn't see the wolf. I approached the podium without my notes, clasping my hands together to hide the fact that they were perfectly steady. "Mark," I began, using his first name to create a false sense of intimacy. "You've always handled our investments, haven't you?" He nodded, leaning back comfortably. "Someone had to. Leah, you were always too emotional for numbers." He smiled at the judge, inviting her to share in his misogyny. "I just wanted to ensure our future was secure." He added. He was performing the role of the benevolent patriarch. "Of course," I said softly, lowering my head as if shamed. "You were always so good at taking care of things." I looked up then, allowing a small, sad smile to touch my lips. It was the smile I used to give him when I forgave him for missing dinner. The one he associated with my submission. He relaxed completely, his shoulders dropping. He thought he had won. He walked into the trap with his chest puffed out, convinced he owned the ground he was about to fall through. "Mr. Harrington, let's discuss your travel schedule for the fiscal year of 2022. I kept my tone conversational, almost bored. Flipping through a stack of papers I didn't actually need. Mark relaxed instantly, leaning into the microphone, with the ease of a man who loves the sound of his own voice. "Extensive," he answered, flashing a charming smile at the court reporter. "I go where the work is. Global logistics requires global presence." He thought I was establishing his hard work to justify his salary. He smiled, utterly oblivious to the noose tightening around his neck. "On the 14th of January, you stated in your sworn deposition that you were in meetings in Manhattan. Is that accurate?" Mark didn't hesitate for a second. Yes, brutal meetings. All day. I nodded slowly, pretending to check a box on my list with a red pen. And you didn't leave the country during that week? Absolutely not. He scoffed, rolling his eyes at my apparent incompetence. I don't have time for vacations, Leah. I was working to support you. Sterling shifted in his seat, sensing the specificity of the date, but Mark was too busy enjoying his performance. So, if I showed you incorporation papers for Apex Holdings signed in Grand Cayman on the 15th of January, that wouldn't be you. Mark laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed off the wood paneling. Common name. Coincidence. I was in New York, as I said. He looked at the judge, shaking his head with mock pity. She sees conspiracies in paperwork, Your Honor. The judge didn't smile back this time. She was watching me. I reached into my box, bypassing the legal files and pulling out something far more personal. It was a glossy photograph. Exhibit D, I announced, walking to the bailiff and handing him the photo. He walked it over to the witness stand. Mark took it with a frown, his brows knitting together in genuine confusion. What is this? He asked, turning the paper over as if the answer was written on the back. It's a selfie, I said simply. You sent it to me on the 15th of January via text. You captioned it, grinding in the concrete jungle. Mark stared at the image. It showed him smiling, wearing aviator sunglasses, with a blurry gray background. Look closer at your sunglasses, Mark. I instructed, my voice cutting through the room's sudden silence. He squinted at the photo, bringing it inches from his nose. I turned to the judge. I have provided a magnified version for the court. In the reflection of Mr. Harrington's lenses, you can clearly see palm trees. I paused, letting the image sink in. And behind the palm trees, the signage for the Cayman National Bank. The air left the room instantly. Mark pulled the photo closer, his hands starting to tremble. The gray background wasn't a wall. It was a storm cloud. You sent that to me to brag? I said quietly. You thought I was too stupid to look at the details. You thought I was just a wife waiting at home. Mark's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He remembered the moment now. The arrogance of it. The thrill of lying to my face, while standing directly in front of the evidence of his fraud. He had documented his own perjury, because he needed validation more than he needed security. The photo rattled in his shaking hand, hitting the microphone with a dull thud. The timestamp on that photo is 2 p.m., I continued, relentless. The incorporation documents for Apex Holdings were signed at 2:15 p.m. at that very bank. I looked at the judge, whose expression had turned to stone. Mr. Harrington wasn't in New York. He was hiding $2 million in assets, while his wife sat at home paying bills with a maxed-out credit card. Sterling didn't even stand up to object. He stared at his client with open disdain. There is no legal defense for a client who hands the prosecution a geotagged confession wrapped in a lie. Mark looked up from the photo, his eyes wild and searching. He looked at Sterling, who refused to meet his gaze, staring resolutely at his shoes. He looked at the judge, who was writing furiously in her ledger. Finally, he looked at me. For the first time in our marriage, he didn't look down on me. He looked at me with fear. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin another story, but nothing came out. The charm was gone. The suit suddenly looked too big for him. The invincible CEO was shrinking right before our eyes. Do you wish to amend your testimony regarding your whereabouts on the 14th of January? I asked, closing the trap. Mark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. I might have been mistaken about the dates, he rasped, his voice cracking. A ripple of murmurs went through the gallery. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a felony. The judge set her pen down with a heavy clatter that sounded like a gavel strike. The color didn't just drain from his face, it vanished, leaving him looking like a statue of a fallen king. The courtroom buzzed with the low, frantic energy of a hive kicked over. The judge was staring at Mark with the cold precision of a hanging judge. Sterling didn't wait for permission. He practically vaulted out of his chair, hand raised like a shield. "Your Honor! The defense requests an immediate recess," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He didn't look at the judge. He was already grabbing Mark's arm, digging his fingers into the expensive fabric. He needed to stop the bleeding before his client talked himself into a cell. We were granted 15 minutes. I stayed at my table, watching them retreat to the far corner near the bailiff's exit. Sterling was whispering furiously, his face red and sweating. Mark looked like a deflated balloon, all his sharp edges gone soft with fear. After 2 minutes, Sterling walked back alone. He carried a folded piece of yellow legal paper. He slid it across the mahogany table toward me. It moved silently, like a bribe in a bad movie. "Take it," he hissed. "It's everything you asked for." I unfolded the paper. The number written there was staggering. It was more than I had asked for in my initial filing. It was enough to buy a house, a new car, a new life. Enough to disappear and never think about Mark Harrington again. But then I read the fine print scrawled at the bottom. Full NDA. Sealed records. No admission of wrongdoing. They were trying to buy my silence one last time. They wanted to pay me to help them bury the body of their crime. My hands hovered over the paper. For a split second, the old Leah tempted me. The Leah who just wanted safety, who wanted the shouting to stop. I could sign this and walk out a rich woman. But if I signed, Mark won. He would keep his reputation. He would do this again to the next woman, and the next. I looked at Mark across the room. He was watching me with a glimmer of hope. He thought everything was for sale, because he had sold his soul years ago. I picked up the yellow paper and folded it slowly, watching Mark's eyes track the movement. Then, I tore it in half. The sound was sharp, louder than a shout in the quiet room. Mark flinched physically. Sterling closed his eyes, exhaling a long, defeated breath. I stood up as the bailiff called the court back to order. I didn't want his money if it came with his muzzle. I wanted the one thing he couldn't write a check for. I walked back to the podium. The plaintiff rejects the settlement offer. I announced to the stunned room. The judge looked surprised but nodded, resuming her position. "I have one final piece of evidence, Your Honor." I pulled a small USB drive from my pocket. Exhibit E. An audio recording from the 24th of December of last year. Mark frowned, confusion replacing his fear. He remembered Christmas Eve. We had argued. He thought he had won that fight too. He didn't know his phone had remained active after he stormed out of the house. The clerk plugged the drive into the court system. I looked at Mark. "You thought you hung up after calling your mistress," I said softly. "You didn't." The speakers crackled to life. Mark's voice filled the room, booming and distorted but undeniable. He was laughing. "She's crying in the kitchen right now." The recording played. Pathetic. "She thinks the law matters." The voice on the recording paused to take a drink. "The law is for poor people, babe. I can buy a judge before breakfast." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The judge stopped writing. She looked up, her face draining of all neutrality. Insulting the legal system was one thing. Suggesting she was purchasable was a death sentence. Mark stood up, knocking his chair over. "That's illegal," he screamed, his voice cracking. "That's a private conversation!" Sterling tried to pull him down, but Mark was frantic now. He sounded exactly like the man on the tape. The juxtaposition was perfect. He was destroying himself in stereo. The recording continued over Mark's shouting. "I moved the last $2 million to the Nevis Trust yesterday." The recorded Mark boasted. "Let her get a lawyer. By the time they find the money, I'll be retired on the beach." The audio ended with a click. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't just evidence of hidden assets anymore. It was evidence of contempt, of malice, of a premeditated plan to defraud the court. Mark stood frozen, staring at the speakers as if they were a smoking gun. Sterling didn't even try to object. He simply closed his laptop and began packing his bag, distancing himself from the blast radius. Mark looked at me, his eyes pleading for a mercy he had never shown. I met his gaze and felt nothing but a cool, clean emptiness. The fear was gone. The anger was gone. There was only the truth, sitting naked in the center of the room. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the record showing exactly who he was and exactly who I was. The audio file ended, but the echo of Mark's laughter seemed to linger in the rafters. The judge removed her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose with slow, deliberate movements. When she looked up, her face was no longer a mask of judicial neutrality, but a portrait of controlled fury. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "you have insulted this court, perjured yourself, and admitted to fraud." She struck her gavel once, a sound like a pistol crack. "Bailiffs, take the defendant into custody, pending a federal inquiry." 2 uniformed officers moved in on Mark before he could process the command. He looked at them with genuine confusion, as if they were staff members who had misunderstood a drink order. "Wait," he stammered, pulling his arm back instinctively. "I am the CEO of Harrington Logistics. You can't touch me." The metallic click of handcuffs was the only response he got. It was a cold, final sound that cut through his delusion. For the first time in his life, his money couldn't buy the key. Mr. Sterling did not object. He didn't even look up as his client was hauled toward the holding cell door. He snapped his briefcase shut with a sharp click. The sound of a mercenary closing the book on a failed contract. As he walked past my table, he paused for a fraction of a second to adjust his tie. He looked at my cardboard box, then at my face. "Good luck, Mrs. Harrington," he muttered. It wasn't an apology. It was the grudging respect one soldier gives another after a slaughter. The judge turned her attention to me. The harshness in her eyes softened, replaced by a weary sort of approval. "The court orders a full forensic audit of all assets," she declared, signing the order with a sharp flourish of her pen. "All accounts are frozen effective immediately. You will have your transparency, Lee." She used my first name. It was a small breach of protocol, but it felt like a knighthood. I nodded, unable to speak, as the crushing weight of 3 years finally lifted off my chest. I packed my single cardboard box slowly. I placed the USB drive on top of the stack, right next to the selfie that had undone him. The courtroom was empty now, save for the clerk, who offered me a shy, tentative smile. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking on the marble floor. The sound wasn't hesitant anymore. It was rhythmic and strong. I pushed open the heavy oak doors, leaving the smell of floor wax and old lies behind me forever. Outside, the city roared with life. The afternoon sun hit my face, warm and blindingly bright. I stopped at the top of the courthouse steps, taking a deep breath of air that didn't taste like fear. I caught my reflection in the glass of the revolving doors. I didn't see the poor, abandoned wife Mark had laughed at. I saw a woman who had walked through fire and came out holding the match. My husband laughed when I stood up. He wasn't laughing now.